much. It's good to follow on from these discussions, and hopefully some of the issues we'll be able to continue to discuss. As Wendy was saying, I'm part of a team that produces this report, the Education for All Global Monitoring Report. For those who don't know, it monitors progress towards education goals, and each year there's a different theme. So last year was on reaching the marginalised, and I'll be partly talking about some issues that were in there in relation to conflict. But next year, as in 2011, the report is actually specifically on education and conflict. So I'm actually really keen to hear what everybody's got to say. And it's due to be launched in about February next year. I think my one message that I wanted to sort of for us to discuss and think about further was around the actual term emergencies in relation to conflict-affected settings. In many countries that are conflict-affected, what would be seen as an emergency phase goes on for a decade or 2 decades. And yet, these countries are ones that are still stuck in a humanitarian response mode. Now, we know that in general, the humanitarian development divide in aid structures is problematic, but it's even more problematic for education for the reasons that Greg was mentioning, where education is still not given full recognition within those responses. So for me, that was the sort of key issue that I'm wanting to discuss, and I'll sort of follow up with some more data and information around that. I just have to say that having just come back from northern Kenya and visited some refugee camps, the refugee camps in northern Kenya, it was really this issue was really striking. You go to the schools and you ask the children how long have they been in the camp, how long have they been in the school. They've been their whole lives in these schools. That is their education. If education weren't provided, they would in camps they would have no education. And the teachers themselves have also generally been educated within those camp settings. So just to give a few facts and figures, from the data that we publish in the report, there are around 72 million children out of school. Now, the numbers who live in conflict-affected countries, the estimates vary between about 1/3 and 1/2. We look here in our report specifically at those living in conflict-affected poor countries, and in 20 of these countries, around 1/3 of these account for around 1/3 of that 72 million children. So it is a huge issue in relation to achieving the Education for All and MDG goals, as Greg was saying. Also, of those that are forcibly displaced, about 1/3 are children. So this is sort of, again, the important issue of needing to provide services to children who are in a situation of being forcibly displaced, which again is a situation they live in for many years in many circumstances. Another example is Pakistan, which is host to 2 million refugees from Afghanistan, and half of these refugees are estimated to be out of school. So again, it illustrates the scale of the issue. Now, conflict affects education in a variety of ways, as we've been hearing. It affects education via attacks on schools and teachers. For those of you who aren't aware, there was a report that came out by UNESCO last year looking at education under attack, which documented a wide range of experiences where schools have been quite directly attacked in many situations, as well as being at the forefront of indirect attacks. Recruitment of child soldiers, psychosocial distress, and so on. So there are many ways in which this relation plays out. But also we need to look at it from the other side, that inappropriate education policies can contribute to conflict. So if we're not ignoring education in these contexts, we're also going to be potentially doing further damage. Inequality of access to education, poor quality provision, inappropriate language of instruction, insufficient links with employment opportunities, which can create a pool of disaffected youth. This can all help to contribute to the causes of conflict in the first place. So in these 20 conflict-affected poor countries that we were looking at, looking at this group of countries, we see that they account for around 40% of the total financing gap for education. In the report last year, we did a detailed analysis of how much it was going to cost to reach the education for all goals, and in particular to get all children into school. And the overall cost was found to be around $16 billion, of which per year, of which 40% is in these countries alone. So again, they are a particularly large part of the challenge. Now, on the positive side, we can see that development aid to education in these countries has increased over the decade, and this is in part due to the increased attention to conflict-affected countries by donors more generally. So it's not just in relation to education, but more general trend that there has been some positive changes. And we can see, for example, in the UK context, there are a number of reports and documents and papers which really sort of highlight the priority that these countries are now getting, partly in the context of wanting to achieve the MDG goals, and partly in the light of concerns around security, global security, and so on. However, even though there has been this positive trend, they are still grossly underfunded, not just from the humanitarian side, but also if we look at development aid, they receive less than 1/5 of the development aid to education, although, as I've said, they're home, these 20 countries are home to more than 1/3 of children out of school. Of course, there's a great deal of diversity. None of these countries are the same, and this is part of the challenge for working in these contexts. This particular graph is just trying to show how, you might not be able to read it very easily, but how skewed the aid is across different country settings. This is the amount of aid per primary school age child, and we can see at one end we've got Afghanistan, which is, for example, and Rwanda, which have been receiving reasonably large amounts of aid per primary school age child, so that's around $20 per child. At the other end, we've got countries such as Côte d'Ivoire, Central African Republic, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, which have extremely small allocations. So, for example, DRC, which I'll come back to, the allocation is around $2 per child, which is small by any sense. Of the average for low-income countries overall is $12. And this is a country where there are 4 million children out of school. Part of the reason we can see that diversity depends on the extent to which they are seen as global security risks. Part of it is to do with whether they are still in the public eye. Is the media still seeing it as a country that requires a response, or is it something that has gone quieter and therefore is getting less attention for all sorts of reasons? In terms of the increased attention to education in emergencies, Greg has already mentioned the establishment of the education cluster, but I think we need to recognise also the work of Save the Children themselves, because it really has put on the spotlight the issue of education in emergencies. The Rewrite the Future campaign in particular, if you talk to people from all different agencies and areas, they will be aware of both the actual work that's been going on the ground as well as the advocacy, and I think it has been extremely influential. And I think a question is about the continuation of this type of work, because we're in a sense at a peak where these issues are now being discussed. This audience here is a testament to that, but we're also at risk of things slipping back. Similarly, in relation to the work of the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies, I think these two have been particularly influential. Greg has already mentioned that there's only 2% of humanitarian aid spent on education, so although there has been all this discussion and dialogue and impetus, we're still way behind where we need to be. This isn't to say that other aspects of the humanitarian response are not essential. Of course, it is food and security, food and shelter and so on are absolutely essential. But as we were hearing in the discussion earlier, education needs to be at the table too. But it is consistently one of the most underfunded sectors. It's around, of the appeals, it only actually receives around 1/3 of the funding that's asked for. And part of the issue here is that many donors, including the UK, don't include education explicitly in their humanitarian policy. This makes it difficult for them to respond. They might do so in different ways, through multilateral responses, through including school construction under other headings within that humanitarian response, but it doesn't make it easy for their work to do so. Just to give an example of a particularly protracted conflict with high needs but low aid, this hopefully illustrates to some extent the issue. You can see the bottom line there is the amount of aid to education, which has stayed consistently low, just scraping the surface. Humanitarian aid to education in DRC has remained in place. Obviously, the DRC has been moving in and out of conflict. Despite various peace accords, there are still issues there in parts of the country. But even though humanitarian aid is actually quite important in the overall aid package, education is only getting 1% of that. So it's not going to be responding to the needs either through development aid nor through humanitarian aid. And this is an example where education is falling through those cracks. There are various good positive examples of countries and donors doing work that is innovative and I think moving us forward. And the UK, I've put a couple of examples from the UK here, given that we're talking about the UK context, I think has been at the forefront of some of these issues. In Nepal, for example, even in the midst of conflict, there were pooled funding within a basic education programme. In Sierra Leone and Rwanda, the UK moved in very early with some other funders to help to ensure that education was supported through multi-donor approaches and through general budgetary support. And as some people were commenting earlier, this has been important both for education outcomes as well as for broader state building, and I think there really is evidence in these countries of that happening. Multi-donor approaches clearly have an important role to play. I've put a question up here which people might want to discuss further, is for those that are familiar with the Education for All Fast Track initiative, which is a multi-donor fund aimed to support education in different countries. Up until recently, it has been supporting good performers, so not usually conflict-affected countries, but there are now moves to try and ensure that it can, and the question is how and whether this is appropriate, I think, is still under discussion. But to end, I think the two things that don't work and are continuing to hold back progress, one is the failure to recognise education in response to humanitarian responses, and this is holding back progress for a whole generation of learners. It's even if the crisis is short term, 1 year out of school, children usually won't go back into school, but for many it's a lot longer. And then the last point, that if we're looking for short-term results in the debates we're having recently about looking for value for money, this is not going to be effective in terms of our longer-term goals of peace and security. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline.